Welcome back to A Wicked Historian.
Imagine you're 12 years old. You're standing inside a stone church in medieval France. The candles are smoking. The air smells like damp wool and cold incense. You've never left your village. And today, you're getting married. The man waiting at the altar is 40. You've never spoken to him. You didn't say yes. But your father did. And in this world, that's the only yes that matters. The priest begins the ceremony in Latin, words you don't understand, sealing a contract you never agreed to. Outside the church doors, the celebration isn't just for the wedding. They're waiting for tonight, because in medieval Europe, marriage wasn't about love, it was about ownership, and once the vows were spoken, your body no longer belonged to you. This wasn't rare, it wasn't scandalous, it wasn't illegal. It was normal, and the truth about medieval marriage is far darker than the fairy tales we grew up with. Between roughly the 6th and 15th centuries across Europe, marriage functioned less like a romantic union and more like a legal and economic alliance. For noble families, daughters were political leverage. For merchants, they were business contracts. For peasants, they were survival strategies, the younger the bride, the longer she could produce heirs. Among aristocratic families, girls were often betrothed as children, legally. The church required consent by the 12th century, but consent didn't always mean freedom. A young girl raised from birth to obey had very little real choice. One of the most famous examples is Margaret Beaufort. She was married at 12 and gave birth at 13. The delivery nearly killed her, and likely left her unable to have more children. She survived. Many didn't. For noble families, marriage meant alliance. For everyone else, it meant survival. But survival came at a cost. Under medieval law, once married, a woman's legal identity was absorbed into her husband's. In England, this later became formalized under the doctrine of coverture, where a wife could not own property independently or sign contracts. She could not accuse her husband of rape, because legally, consent was assumed once she married him. Marriage wasn't temporary, it wasn't optional, and divorce was nearly impossible. For most women, marriage was permanent, no matter what happened behind closed doors. And what happened behind closed doors was rarely discussed, but widely understood. But here's where the story gets darker. Many regions practice something called a bedding ceremony, not always, not everywhere, but often enough. After the wedding feast, guests would escort the couple to the marital bed. Sometimes there were jokes, songs, witnesses who remained long enough to confirm the union had begun. It wasn't always violent, it wasn't always abusive, but it was public, and for a young bride, especially one barely into adolescence, that night could feel like a courtroom without a judge. The sheets were sometimes displayed the next morning to prove virginity, and if there was no blood, questions were asked. Honor was on the line, families were watching. But here's what most history classes don't explain: the system wasn't designed for her happiness. It was designed for stability, land, inheritance, lineage. Marriage was infrastructure, and infrastructure doesn't ask how you feel. Across Europe, medical records and burial data show high mortality among young mothers. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women, especially teenagers. No antibiotics, no surgical anesthesia, no understanding of infection. Pregnancy wasn't glowing. It was dangerous. Some women survived multiple births. Some died during the first, and if a wife died, another marriage could be arranged. The system moved on. But here's the twist most people never consider. Not all women were powerless, some negotiated influence, some became estate managers, some widows gained property rights, some queens ruled nations, but they gained power through the system, not outside it. And the system itself remained unchanged for centuries, because it benefited those who built it. And this is where the illusion of medieval romance collapses: chivalry, knights, courtly love. Those stories existed, but they were stories. The legal reality: marriage was economic, hierarchical, and deeply unequal. And now, we're going inside the wedding night itself. What actually happened during bedding rituals, what guests witnessed, and why foreign visitors described some European customs as shocking. Because the ceremony was only the beginning, the real control started after the door closed, and what happened next shaped generations. You've survived the ceremony, the feast is loud, Wine is flowing, music echoes through stone halls. You're exhausted, but you don't get to leave, because in parts of medieval Europe, the wedding night wasn't entirely private. The bedding ritual began with witnesses escorting the couple to the chamber. In noble households, family members or trusted attendants might remain long enough to confirm the marriage had been physically initiated, not to watch, but to verify. Marriage wasn't complete without consummation. Without it, alliances could collapse, dowries could be disputed, property transfers could be reversed. For elite families, proof mattered, and sometimes that proof required witnesses. Now imagine being 13, surrounded by strangers, dressed in ceremonial silk, aware that tomorrow, your body becomes evidence. In many regions, especially among the aristocracy, sheets were inspected the next morning. Blood symbolized virginity, though medically, that expectation was unreliable. But medieval biology didn't understand that. If no visible proof appeared, suspicion could follow. Annulments were possible but humiliating, and in extreme cases reputations were destroyed. The pressure was enormous, not just on the bride, on both families, but the darker reality wasn't always spectacle, it was repetition. Marriage meant frequent pregnancies, and pregnancy meant risk. Historical demographic studies suggest maternal mortality in medieval Europe may have been as high as 1 in 10 per birth in some regions, and lifetime risks significantly higher. Teen brides faced greater complications, obstructed labor, infections, hemorrhage. There were no emergency C-sections, no sterile tills, no pain management beyond herbs. Childbirth wasn't symbolic, it was survival, and survival wasn't guaranteed. Under English common law, the husband had legal authority over household discipline. While extreme violence could theoretically be punished, enforcement was inconsistent. In practice, domestic abuse often went unchallenged. And since women couldn't independently own most property, leaving meant poverty. Returning to your father, not always allowed. Joining a convent, rare and expensive. Escaping, nearly impossible. Marriage wasn't a partnership, it was a contract backed by law and religion. But here's something most modern viewers don't expect. Some women resisted quietly. Letters survive where wives describe emotional withdrawal, religious devotion as a refuge, illness as a shield. Others formed alliances with servants, managed estates when husbands traveled, and raised sons who later reformed laws. Resistance wasn't always loud, sometimes it was survival. And yet, the mythology persisted. Songs of courtly love, stories of noble knights. Because those stories were safer to tell, they were easier to remember. They made medieval Europe look romantic instead of rigid, but the legal framework? It lasted for centuries, and its echoes still exist, in property law, in marital legal history, in debates about bodily autonomy. And now we're going to examine how later historians softened this reality, how Renaissance writers reshaped the narrative, and why the version of medieval marriage we re-taught today often leaves out the parts that make us uncomfortable.
The strangest part of medieval marriage isn't what happened in the church. It isn't the bedding ritual, it isn't even the danger of childbirth. The strangest part is how carefully it was softened. Because when Europe moved into the Renaissance, something changed. Not the laws, not the power structures, the story. Writers began polishing the Middle Ages into something more poetic, romantic, chivalrous, knights rescuing maidens, ladies inspiring devotion, courtly love elevated into legend. Take Giovanni Boccaccio. His works are filled with wit, scandal, romance, and human drama. But even when marriage appears troubled, it's wrapped in narrative charm. Later, historians like Edward Gibbon documented the fall of empires with sharp analysis. Yet everyday domestic life rarely became the center of moral outrage. Because domestic hierarchy wasn't shocking, it was normal. And what is normal rarely feels dramatic enough to condemn. So instead of asking, was this system fair? Writers ask, was it stable? And stability won. By the Victorian era, medieval Europe had been transformed into a fantasy landscape. Paintings of armored knights kneeling before noble ladies, stories of pure devotion, gentle courtship. But here's what's fascinating. Victorian society itself operated under strict gender roles. Separate legal identities for men and women only began shifting in the 19th century. So medieval marriage didn't look brutal to them, it looked familiar. Under English common law, coverture still shaped married women's legal status well into the 1800s. A married woman's property automatically transferred to her husband. That wasn't medieval, that was modern, which meant confronting medieval inequality too directly would have forced uncomfortable comparisons. So historians softened the edges. They emphasized romance over regulation, chivalry over childbirth mortality, poetry over property law. And here's where it gets even more interesting. When 20th century scholars, especially women, began re-examining medieval court records, personal letters, and legal archives, a more layered picture emerged. Not a horror movie, not a fairy tale, but a structure. A system where marriage secured land, marriage secured heirs, marriage secured alliances. Love, sometimes. Equality, rarely. Women navigated this world carefully. Some gained influence through widowhood. Others ruled as regents. A few queens held real authority, but their power was often conditional, granted through marriage, not independent of it. The structure remained intact, and yet, we have to be precise. Not every medieval marriage was violent. Not every husband was cruel. Not every bride was powerless. Human relationships are always more complicated than laws. There were couples who formed genuine partnerships. There were households built on affection. There were letters between spouses that revealed tenderness. But those moments existed inside a framework that legally favored men. And frameworks matter because they shape what is possible. The most uncomfortable truth about medieval marriage isn't that it was uniquely evil, it's that it was ordinary. For centuries, it functioned. It produced heirs, it transferred land, it stabilized kingdoms. And because it worked for the powerful, it endured. That's the part that lingers. Systems don't survive for 1,000 years because they're chaotic. They survive because they're efficient. Even when they're unequal. Now fast forward. Today in the United States, you can choose your partner. You can refuse marriage entirely. You can file for divorce. You can own property. You have independent legal identity. Marital rape is recognized as a crime. Domestic violence laws exist. Child marriage laws are heavily restricted, though still debated in some states. Those rights did not fall from the sky. They evolved slowly through legal reform, activism, court battles, and cultural shifts. And when you understand how marriage once functioned, modern debates feel different because history is ancient dust. It's a blueprint, and blueprints leave outlines. Here's the deeper question. If you had been born in 1300, what would your life have looked like? Would you have been married at 12? Would you have survived childbirth, or would you have inherited land? Or would your identity have disappeared under someone else's name? That's not fantasy. That was probability. The fairy tale version of the Middle Ages is comforting. Castles, banquets, heroic romance. But the legal reality, marriage was infrastructure, structured, hierarchical, enduring. And once you see that structure, you start noticing structures everywhere, in law, in culture, in expectations. History isn't just about what happened, it's about what lasted. So the next time someone says, things were simpler back then, remember, they were simpler for some, not for everyone, and the distance between romance and reality is often measured in who had power and who didn't. If this changed how you see medieval history, then you're ready for the next layer, because marriage was only one piece. Wait until we examine the hidden lives of medieval popes, the secret habits of kings, and the rituals that shaped Europe behind monastery walls. The Middle Ages weren't just dark, they were strategic. And once we start peeling back the myths, there's no going back to fairy tales subscribed to a wicked historian.